The purpose of these lectures, as I said in the course description, is not to recount the story of Ayn Rand's life. For that, I've prepared a chronology which you can pick up today after Dr. Mode's lecture. It will be in the back of the room on the table near where the water is. I didn't want you to be tempted to look it over during either of the lectures. And you can pick that up at the end today. Ayn Rand was an utterly unique human being, and my subject is how she got that way. That is her development. As she said, man is a being of self-made soul, and my concern is the steps by which she made her own soul. And I will be focusing on the three aspects that were mentioned in the course description: her intellectual development, her unique intelligence and mental qualities, her artistic development, particularly the formation of her romantic sense of life, and her moral development. Since my theme is her development, almost all of these two lectures will be devoted to her early youth. I'll only go up to about age 14. Then tomorrow, at the end of the lecture, I will jump to 1958 to cover a turning point in her life, the decision to write on philosophy. Now, this talk is based on three sources. First, on taped biographical interviews with Ayn Rand, 19 of them, of 2 to 3 hours each. These interviews were done from December 1960 through May 1961. Secondly, there are photographs, letters, and other material from Miss Rand's personal effects. She saved everything. Thirdly, there are my own recollections of her later years. For the record, my first exposure to Ayn Rand came in 1962. I was formally introduced to her in 1964. Over the next 15 years, I very gradually got to know her personally. I had repeated but rather limited contact with her until about 1979. From then until her death in 1982, I had the opportunity to spend quite a good deal of time with her and to discuss many topics, including her own recollections of her history. Basically, I'll be letting Ayn Rand speak for herself. There will be a lot of quoting. I will interject my own comments from time to time, but it's largely her voice that you'll be hearing. As introductory orientation to her life, I'm going to quote from two autobiographical statements that she made, just briefly. The first is a 4-page autobiographical sketch that she wrote at age 31 in 1936 as publicity for the British publisher of We the Living. Here is the first paragraph. Now, this is 1936, decades before there was such a thing as objectivism. If a life can have a theme song, and I believe every worthwhile one has, mine is a religion, an obsession, or a mania, or all of these expressed in one word: individualism. I was born with that obsession and have never seen and do not know now a cause more worthy, more misunderstood, more seemingly hopeless, and more tragically needed. Call it fate or irony, but I was born of all countries on earth in the one least suitable for a fanatic of individualism, Russia. Close quote. Ayn Rand was, in fact, born in St. Petersburg, Russia, in February 2nd, 1905. Incidentally, by the old Russian calendar system, her birthday was January 20th, which I think gives future ages a chance to celebrate 13 days of holiday instead of the 12 days of Christmas. St. Petersburg, I was sort of surprised to learn, was a city of 2 or 3 million people at that time, and it was then the capital, not Moscow, but St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia. The city was renamed Petrograd in 1914 and was renamed Leningrad after Lenin's death in 1924. Ayn Rand always referred to the city as Petrograd, which was what it was named during most of her adult life. In the city. Ayn Rand's original last name was Rosenbaum. Her first name was Alisa. That's as close as I can come to the pronunciation of it. Alyssa, if you had no Russian pronunciation at all. That name is translated into English as Alice. I don't like to think of it as Alice, which comes across to me as a very flat, prosaic name, the opposite of Ayn Rand. And I think to translate it Alice does the same violence to her name as if you took the French name Françoise and made it Frances. I apologize to any Alices and Franceses who may be hearing this. Miss Rand once told me that her mother named her after a French princess born a little earlier. Her mother, like many cultured St. Petersburgers, admired French culture. This turned out to be very important in Ayn Rand's development because her mother required her to read French stories and novels in order to learn the language. And that was how she discovered some of her favorite fiction, including Victor Hugo. The name Ayn was Miss Rand's adaptation of a Finnish name, Aino, A-I-N-O. There is a rather dubious story that she took her last name from a Remington Rand typewriter. This story, attributed to one of her American cousins, has her choosing her name at age 21 while in Chicago in 1926 en route to Hollywood, where she began her career. Now, I can't disprove that story, but it would be far more in character for her to have chosen her name long before that, while still in Russia, when presumably she wouldn't have had access to such a thing as a Remington Rand typewriter. She knew from the age of 9 that she would be a writer, and she planned her life long range. So I think this is probably invention on the part of the relative. Now, the second autobiographical sketch, I just want to read one sentence from as an intro to the main body of our progression. That's the sketch about the author, which you probably have read. It appears in the back of the paperback edition of Atlas Shrugged. There she states, "I have held the same philosophy I now hold from as far back as I can remember." How far back could she remember? Here are her earliest memories. To give you a sense of the taped transcripts of these interviews, I'm reading now her first memory with absolutely no editing, exactly as she reeled it off, and it appears on the tapes. All subsequent quotes from the tapes I have edited for clarity, smoothness, and to eliminate repetitions, but they're still essentially quite close to what she said. So this is unaltered. In the middle of the second interview, she says, "Incidentally, I didn't mention my first memory, which is at the age of 2.5, which is, sort of unusual. And what I remember is sitting on the windowsill." I think the first slide will not show this. How do we get the slides going? Can we dim the house lights? This is from the autobiographical sketch period. This is not from age 2.5, as you may have guessed. I like this photo, not only because she looks great in it, but this table here was designed by her husband, Frank O'Connor. And this is in the apartment. I was never in this apartment, but this is 36 East 36th Street and in New York. And this is where she wrote most of Atlas Shrugged. Okay, now the exact slide I wanted. And what I remember is sitting on the windowsill in winter with Father beside me, and I was looking in the street at the first Russian streetcars. It was the first streetcars in Petrograd, and I remember the colored lights. They were yellow and red. And Father was explaining to me what it was, and I already could understand what streetcars were, you see. The reason why I know the age is because later I asked what year it was, and it was in 1907, and I was 2.5 at that time. Now I want to make some observations on that. Are you getting the echo that I am, or can you hear all right? It's fine? Okay, then we'll proceed. First of all, yes, it is sort of unusual to remember back to age 2.5, and it reflects Ayn Rand's unique type of mind. The quality everyone recognized as characteristic of Ayn Rand was her phenomenal intelligence. Even her opponents marveled at her mental powers. You have read her writings and you are here, so you know the kind of genius she was. I don't have to make that point, but I do want to comment on one aspect of her mind. She possessed extraordinary self-consciousness. She was constantly aware of what her mind was doing. If you asked her about any of her ideas, values, or emotional reactions, what they came from, what they meant, how she reached them, she could tell you, and in detail. Her thinking was conscious, explicit, definite, decisive. She remembered her thinking because her thinking was so important to her. Returning to that first memory, note that the sight of this new mechanical marvel, streetcars, was the first event to be permanently recorded in the mind of the future author of Atlas Shrugged, which of course celebrates railroads and champions the innovative mind. Note also colors and lights receive special attention. You can observe, if you look at the descriptive passages in her novels, that colors and lights are often featured. In retrospect, we already see the perspective of the incipient artist, one with a strong sense of the visual. Her second memory, which is not of much interest, was of her newly arrived baby sister, Natasha. Quote, "My second sister was just born, and I remember a scene where they were bundling her in something, and I was looking on in kind of astonishment at this new baby. She was 2.5 years younger," close quote. And see, being 2.5 years younger, she can date the memory to age 2.5. Could we have some lights? I'll leave this on, but. When she was 3, her family moved from one apartment to another, and Ayn remembered the move, plus a minor experience connected with it. Mother explained that we would be left at my cousin's while she went to the new apartment. I remember arguing with her. Could I have the kind of midi blouses that my cousins were wearing? She didn't approve of midi blouses, and I remember her refusing me. Also, the adults were drinking tea, and I asked, couldn't I have some tea? Mother said, no, I'm too young. I remember the feeling of having already done quite a great deal of thinking in my own mind. Why won't they let me have what I want? Someday I'll have it. Close quote. Now, the thoughts themselves are not unusual, and the subjects are, from an adult's viewpoint, decidedly trivial. But looking ahead to the author of The Virtue of Selfishness, a lot is foreshadowed in those two recollected thoughts. Why won't they let me have what I want? Someday I'll have it. What's foreshadowed is independence, the demand for reasons, self-assertiveness, and the patience of a long-range perspective. I think already there we see the solemn dedication to oneself of the person who was to become the world's greatest defender of selfishness. But more interesting even than that is her remembering, quote, the feeling of having already done quite a great deal of thinking in my own mind. I'm not sure that it's at all unusual to have done a great deal of thinking by age 3. It is unusual to have thought much about your It is unusual to have thought much about your right to have your own way, and what I think is quite unusual and significant is that she remembered the feeling of having done it. At the start of the recollection, she put it in this way. You know how you can remember an isolated scene with the implication that there was quite a lot of thinking you had done before that? No, I can't say that I do. This and the fact that her first recollections are from so early is an indication of how seriously she took her own thinking. The best way I could put it is this. Think of the way the most devoted objectivist would listen to her ideas. That's the way she listened to herself, with that kind of interest and respect. After all, it was Ayn Rand thinking. She had no idle thoughts. Where the rest of us, musing on some subject, might get an interesting idea and let it drop, saying, oh, well, she had to know. It might take her years to know, or she might never know, but she didn't let her thoughts dissolve into vapor. The heroes of her novels are speaking for her when they struggle to grasp some issue that concerns them. It isn't fiction, it's autobiography. For example, Rourke's commitment to discover the principle behind the dean. Reardon's struggle to grasp the sanction of the victim. I think that drive to know is one difference between a bright person and a great intellect. A bright person senses a question mark about something. Say, like Rourke, he gets the sense of a deep difference between himself and someone he deals with. He thinks about it for a few seconds and then lets it go, and the embryonic thought is gone. A great intellect gets that same embryonic thought and files it as important, with a standing order to integrate all related information on it that he receives from then on. It's remembered and kept alive until answered. And that's the urgency that Ayn Rand felt about ideas. She never regarded ideas as a luxury. She had a driving curiosity and with a very practical orientation. Correct ideas were her tools of coping with life, and she was constantly on the lookout for better understanding. Near the end of her life, I asked Ayn Rand, projecting my own experience onto her, do you feel that you didn't become mature when you reached a certain age, but that you are always becoming more mature? She said, no, she didn't, and looked at me faintly questioningly. Trying to save my dignity, I rephrased the question. Well, do you feel that you are constantly learning more about life? Oh, yes, she responded, and I wonder how I ever survived yesterday not knowing what I know today. That captures her attitude toward the urgent practical need for understanding. And understanding for her meant conceptual understanding, identifying abstract principles that she could apply in relation to her values. Now, you've had a glimpse of her, of who she was from her early recollection. Now let's look at where she was, her family environment. But a prefatory word of caution. Contrary to the views of most biographers, family is not fate. I quote from Ayn Rand's fiction writing lectures on the subject. Neither I nor any rational person would form his first impression of men or women from his father and mother. That is a totally unwarranted Freudian interpretation, a pat bromide of modern psychologists. First of all, nobody forms an abstraction from just one concrete. To form an abstraction, you have to have at least two instances. And the moment you know more than one man or one woman, Papa and Mama acquire a status in your eyes which is totally separate from everybody else. That's just family, that's not people. A child very early makes a distinction between his parents and everybody else, close quote. So I discuss her family not as some sort of Freudian influence on her, but so you can see the environment and events from which she consciously drew certain conclusions, conscious, rational conclusions that were important in her development. Her family was her father, her mother, and two younger sisters, Natasha and Nora. The three girls were born exactly 2.5 years apart. Now, that is not the slide I was hoping for, but let's take a minute and look at it. These are slides made from photographs in the estate of Ayn Rand in what we call the warehouse, because there are cartons and cartons and cartons in the warehouse, and they're not dated. So your guess is as good as mine as to how old she is here. I would say 3.5. All right. Ayn Rand's father was Zinovy Zakharovich Rosenbaum, not Franz, as some biographers have had it. He was a self-made man who was quite successful in his business. He owned and ran a pharmacy. As was the custom in this Victorian era, the young children did not interact much with the father. Quote, "In childhood, what I felt for my father was friendly respect and a dutiful affection based on the fact that he was my father. I liked him as a person, but in childhood I had very little to do with him because children's education then was totally in the hands of the mother. Father never interfered or tried to exercise any influence on us. Even then, I probably loved him much more than mother. But it was only after we began to be political allies, when I was 14 or 15, that I felt a real love for him, a love that meant something. I copied Uncle Vasily in We the Living from father, both in appearance and in essential characteristics, though not in every literal detail. But omitting the slight exaggeration of fiction, that would be my father." Now here's some descriptive words from We the Living about Uncle Vasily. "Thick hair, tall, powerful body, sunken eyes like a fireplace with blazing coals. His backbone had been as straight as his gun, his spirit as straight as his backbone." Returning to the interviews. "Father was not quite as sentimental as Uncle Vasily, but he had the same unbending character, the enormous, somewhat repressed integrity. He was predominantly silent. I never knew him to have a personal friend that he cared about. He was very proud of his success in a quiet way. Above all, he was proud of being self-made. He was a man who held very strong ideals, although I didn't discover that until I was 15. He held very firm convictions that were strictly his own, the kind of convictions that I would agree with today. Individualistic ethics in the sense of free enterprise, fair trade, and everything connected with that. He explicitly rejected self-sacrifice in relation to politics," interjecting, which I suppose is a reference to his anti-communism. "Also, I would say he was a complete adherent of rationality, but unfortunately not by stated conviction. For instance, he was non-religious, but he never objected to mother having religious ideas. I heard him express the attitude, well, one can never tell. He seemed truly indifferent on the subject, and this is why I would suspect him of subjectivism." The mother. On the right. I get to use the laser pointer. This is young Ayn Rand, and I suppose this is Natasha, and this is her father. Ayn Rand's mother was Anna Borisovna Rosenbaum. Miss Rand definitely did not admire her mother, but note how scrupulously fair she is as she introduces her discussion of her mother in the taped interviews. Quote, "As to my mother, I'll say frankly that this is a slightly painful subject in one respect. She was so wonderful in being instrumental in sending me to America that I feel unfair in saying anything critical about her. So anything negative I say is said with the preface that I appreciate enormously what she did. During my childhood, I disliked her quite a lot. We really did not get along. In childhood, I thought she was my exact opposite, and in retrospect, I still think so. She was, by principle, basic style, and sense of life, extremely social. Her sole interest was to have parties, to be an intellectual hostess, and to be surrounded by people. My big clashes with Mother in childhood involved the fact that I was antisocial, as she put it. She always demanded that I be more interested in other children. Why don't you play with others? Why don't you have any girlfriends? That was the nagging refrain. To do her justice, she never enforced it, nor made it sound like a serious reproach. She did not make my life miserable over it, but it was always in the air. It's almost as if Howard Rourke had grown up with Mrs. Keating as his mother. Now, that is not Rudolf Nureyev, that is Anna Borisovna, Ayn Rand, and Natasha, the middle sister. What was it like to have a little genius in the house? Did her parents try to make Ayn believe she was nothing special? Thankfully, no. Both parents recognized and appreciated Ayn's intelligence. Quote, Mother and everybody else looked at me as something unusual. They never would use the term child prodigy, but I knew that I was the exceptionally gifted child in effect. I knew it was complimentary. I was glad that that was how they regarded me. Their appreciating my intelligence, I think in retrospect, was a great advantage. But what I would do with that intelligence had absolutely no meaning for them. Incidentally, her mother's main interest in Ayn's intelligence was in using it as something to brag to relatives about. Continuing from Ayn Rand, Mother thoroughly disapproved of my interest in ideas. She never would have said that. She was the literati of the family. She subscribed to all the latest magazines. She discussed plays, books, and so on. But I had the impression she was interested in those things only as a topic of social conversation. What I think she resented in me was the fact that I was interested in ideas as such. She thought all young ladies ought to have artistic interests. But here's a strange thing. She would have been very pleased if I had chosen music, painting, acting, anything but writing. For instance, my sister Natasha wanted to be a pianist, and she graduated from the conservatory. Mother approved thoroughly. That was her idea of a young lady's career. My writing, she merely tolerated. Father, on the other hand, to my surprise, approved very highly. From quite early, I had a very strong sense that anything that I liked had to be mine, not Mother's and not the family's. Therefore, I didn't particularly want to be approved or accepted. Now, we come next to a statement I consider very interesting. In my childhood, Mother always accused me of taking everything too seriously and of being too violently passionate about the things that I liked. Right through her life, Ayn Rand had this same violent passion for her values. And one thing I'd like to communicate in these two lectures is something that it's very hard to pin down. I think of it as Ayn Rand's metaphysical outlook. She lived on a different plane. As a mutual acquaintance once put it, she projected that every minute of her life was important. This sense of her intensity was palpable. When you talked with her, you knew you were in the presence of something totally out of the ordinary. A kind of power radiated out from her. High tension crackled in the air around her. It was a positive tension, unless, of course, you insulted her or attacked her values. But that was the exception. Hers was a life-giving tension. She once asked me whether I thought she was the kind of person who was easy to talk to. And I was rather surprised that my honest answer was yes. She had an odd combination of formality and warmth. And she had great dignity. At the same time, she had a spirit of gaiety, even playfulness. You can see that in the music that she loved. And you can see it in the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, a spirit of gay playfulness for all their seriousness. Let's go back to the quote about her mother. In my childhood, Mother always accused me of taking everything too seriously and of being too violently passionate about the things that I liked. From the earliest, she would pick on anything that I liked. For instance, I once had a doll that I liked. I didn't particularly play with dolls, but this one was something special. Mother got angry at me and broke a leg of that doll. I felt rage and helpless indignation. I screamed at her, and she was immediately regretful and apologized. Her tantrums were never to be taken seriously. Her mother was trying to wound her by means of her love for her values. Perhaps this was data from which Miss Rand later identified in Atlas Shrugged the idea of white blackmail, the idea of the moral extortion racket, which holds the industrialists of the novel hostage to their careers by means of their love for those careers. Now let's turn to her religious training, or lack of it. Ayn Rand was of Jewish descent. She, of course, never thought in such terms. She once told me that there was only one type of situation when she would describe herself as Jewish, when she encountered anti-Semitism. Then she would tell the anti-Semite, "I'm Jewish." Her father, as she stated, was not at all religious, but she describes her mother as, quote, religious in an emotional way, not by conviction, but more by tradition, more out of devotion to her mother, and therefore she never forced religion on us. Mother began by observing 2 holidays a year and then dropped even those 2, so nothing was demanded of us. I had no real religious training. The only relevant childhood incident I remember happened at the age of about 6. One day, a very cute white kitten that grandmother had was sick and dying. And my cousin told me she heard that if we really pray sincerely, God will save the kitten. So we went to a dark room near the kitchen where the adults couldn't see us, and we prayed for this little kitten. The kitten died. I remember thinking that, well, I didn't believe it too much anyway, but I tried. Now, I wouldn't have said, well, then I don't believe in God. It wasn't a test of that kind. It was just a half-hearted idea. I remember feeling, I'm not astonished that nothing happened. Obviously, she didn't get a sense of values and morality from religion, thank God. So what did she base her early values on? On her observation of reality, of what was new and interesting. A value, she wrote in Atlas Shrugged, is that which one acts to gain or keep. How does that come up for a young child? Well, here's an incident I want to relate. It's not what you call a heroic incident, but it's the kind of thing which, repeated hundreds of times, thousands of times, is the source out of which a child makes himself into a hero or a villain or an average Joe. Now here she is, 4 or 5 years old. Let's see if I need the next slide. Let's take a look at the next slide as background for this. No, We'll keep this one on. I'm sorry that I can't match the slides to the narrative, but she didn't take slides throughout her life to match the incidents that she talked about, and we have to make do with what we could scrounge from a box of photographs. So here at 4 or 5 years old, our nursery was usually cluttered up with toys. Among all those toys, my favorite was a mechanical chicken. A little metal chicken you wound with a key, and then it would whir and walk across the room. It was the most foreign-looking toy. Anything foreign was better. It was considered a luxury and somewhat exotic. One day, Mother came into the nursery and found the whole floor littered with toys. She declared that my sister and I had to decide which toys we wanted for the future and which we wanted to keep now. Next year, she would let us exchange the ones we had kept for the ones we had put aside. Well, I put away all the toys I liked best, including that chicken. What I think is significant there was the issue of long-range planning. This is Ayn Rand talking. I remember thinking very consciously that I wouldn't want to give up that chicken in the future. I'd rather look forward to it. In that sense, the future already had a kind of precedence over the immediate moment. So I gave Mother half of the toys, and so did my sister, and Mother took them away. The next year, nothing was said about the toys. Finally, about a year and a half later, I asked Mother, "When do we get the other half back?" She looked very amused. She said, "Oh, I gave them away to an orphanage." Whichever toys you put away for the future were the ones you wanted less. And there were too many toys, so I gave them away. Now, since the whole issue was no longer very important to me, I didn't feel any real pain over it. But I was enormously shocked about the fact that she had lied to us. I remember thinking that it was an enormous injustice. I had been looking forward to getting that toy back. Close quote. When I teach in colleges, people always ask me, how can a helpless young child, too young to think rationally, possibly question the values imposed by its parents? But the issue is whether or not the child judges within the context of its own knowledge. The issue is whether the child places the authority of its parents above its own judgment, however primitive its judgment may be. The issue is whether the child is an active thinker or a mental drifter. In the mechanical chicken episode, what would a non-thinking child have concluded by a process of preconceptual, subverbal generalization? Something like, adults are incomprehensible. Honesty doesn't pay. One's plans can be upset by the unpredictable. So the safest course is not to get too attached to one's values. And Mother knows best, so altruism, giving the toys to the needy orphans, is morally obligatory. The key to Ayn Rand's development here is that because she had thought enough to develop general confidence in her own mind, in choosing to think about this particular incident, she's perfectly willing to entertain the possibility that her mother is simply wrong. Only for a non-thinking child who feels generally at sea is that a threatening prospect. For Ayn Rand, the idea that her mother might be immoral evokes only a shrug. Quote, "It was just one more minus. It merely contributed to my long-standing conclusion at age 4 that her values are not mine." Close quote. The next year, she came across a real malicious dishonesty. At a playground, there was a special kind of swing. Could we have some lights for this? Because it's on the board. Special kind of swing that Ayn Rand loved. I've attempted to draw it here. Maybe some of you know this kind of swing. It consists of a pole with ropes or chains hanging and loops, and kids grab it. It pivots at the top. They run around. Here's Ayn Rand's description of it. 4 children get on, you run in a circle, and when you gain enough momentum, you can fly through the air on that loop. And it's up to your skill. The faster you run, the higher you can be lifted. And I loved that. Now, there was always a waiting line because once you got a hold of one of those loops, you could keep it indefinitely. There was no supervisor there, so it was first come, first served. I always managed to get there early, and I would spend a long time on it. One day I was having a wonderful time riding on it for quite some time, and there were a lot of children waiting. One little boy, about 6, approached me and very nicely asked, would I please let him have it for just one turn? I said, just for one turn? And he said, I promise, very solemnly. I let him take my place, and when the turn ended, I came back for my rope, but he wouldn't give it to me. I was incredulous. I don't remember ever having, before or since, quite such a moral shock. This was the first time I saw someone break his word. I was enraged, and I started to argue with him. He laughed at me in the most insolent way, after having been so winsome and gentle before. Then the swing started up again, and I ran after him and grabbed him. The momentum of the thing threw me down, and I hurt my nose. It started bleeding. It wasn't broken, but I had to be bandaged for quite some time. That was my first encounter with dishonesty. All I remember is, first, enormous astonishment, and then such a murderous rage that if the swing hadn't started up, I probably would have scratched or choked that kid. Because, quote, I think what's interesting is her astonishment. That is exactly the reaction of a child who could not conceive of dishonesty. Ayn Rand had such a fanatical focus on reality that the idea of faking it was at first inconceivable to her. Morality depends on free will. We're talking about the development of her moral values. Morality depends on free will. The moral is the volitional. And here is how Ayn Rand, the child, confronted that issue. Mother also had fits of temper, during which she would declare that she had never wanted to have any children, that she was taking care of us because it was her duty, and exclaim about how much she hated it. Mother at times would say how much she was sacrificing for us. How would an ordinary child respond to this bromide, the complaint of the Jewish mother? How many plays and movies have you seen on the theme of Jewish guilt instilled in children by such motherly complaints? Well, here is how Ayn Rand dealt with it. I remember thinking indignantly from as far back as I can recall that we did not choose to be born. And what is it that we are expected to do about it? Since we could not help it, under what sort of an obligation should we consider ourselves? That is, interjecting, the moral is the volitional, she grasped. It was the injustice, the irrationality of that kind of accusation that I resented very much. The accusation didn't make me feel guilty, and I wasn't particularly bothered by it. If anything, I thought, that's fine, because I did not have any particular feelings towards her. Let's turn now to her sense of life formation, the formation of her passionate, romantic, artist perspective on life. St. Petersburg was Russia's window on Europe, the most sophisticated and Western-oriented of Russian cities. It was common for residents to travel during the summer, and during Ayn Rand's childhood, the family spent most of their summers at a resort on the Black Sea in the Crimea. Ayn Rand's favorite childhood memories concerned the happy summers she spent there, as well as some in Switzerland and Finland. I think you can see how happy she is there with her father. There on the Black Sea, now I don't know that this is the Black Sea, it kind of looks more like Switzerland to me, but there on the Black Sea, she took several important steps towards forging her distinctive sense of life. Quote, "It was at the summer resort at the age of 6 that I found my first concrete value concern. The first time I remember thinking, this is mine. The setting was a ballroom dancing class for young ladies run by a man who was a dancer in the Imperial Ballet. One of the older girls in that class became my first heroine. She was not particularly attractive, but she was tall, exaggeratedly slender, with blue eyes, pale skin, and very red hair. Red hair in Russia was considered terrible, a sign of ugliness. A person with red hair and freckles would almost be laughed at. You see that I remain loyal to red hair as a value. I noticed that nobody seemed to like this girl. She was always alone, silently aloof. I don't know what caused me to admire her. It was nothing particular that she did. If I can butt in here, note that when Ayn Rand doesn't know the cause of some reaction, she states that too. She is very aware of what she understood and what she didn't, even in analyzing her 6-year-old reactions. Continuing, I think I built up something of a dramatic story about her. I was already inventing a fiction heroine. And because no one seemed to like her, I appropriated her. Not as an underdog or a victim, she wasn't that type, and there was no pain connected with my feeling. I thought that her circumstances were tragic, in that people said she was unhappy at home, but she stood for someone above the circumstances. I thought that she was very strong and independent. I held this value defiantly against everybody else. Mother, wouldn't you know it, Mother resented my attitude, and we argued over it. That was my first clash of values. But at that age, the whole issue was not yet fully objective. It was too early for that because I couldn't actually define for myself what her value was, except that I loosely thought she was independent. Nor was it subjective. The issue of objectively defending my choice of values versus those of others had not really arisen yet. Rather, at the age of 6 and 7, my great concern was with discovering such a thing as my values. Again, note the clarity with which she reports her mental processes. The next summer, again, I don't know that this is the next summer, but she looks like she might be a little older there. That's Ayn. That's Natasha, and this is Nora. So whatever age this child is, if you add 5, you get Ayn Rand. The next summer, there was one girl who became quite a symbol for me. There was one hotel in the area which was unusually expensive and was patronized mainly by foreigners. They had a tennis court, the first one I ever saw. Tennis was something very unusual. Anyone who played tennis had to be a foreigner or a sophisticate. Russia, 1914. Our family sometimes had lunch in that hotel, and once I saw a girl of 12 playing tennis. That amazed me. At 7, I had the feeling that today I would have for Dagny Taggart. She was a creature out of a different world, my idea of what a woman should be. She became a symbol of the independent woman from abroad. I even remember her name, Daisy Gerhardi. She was to me then like Greta Garbo, only to the nth degree. The symbol was magnificent. I can still see her, a very active, rather tall, long-legged girl in one of those tennis postures, very decisive. I don't remember her face, only her long-legged agility in playing tennis, and one distinctive feature. She was wearing black stockings with white tennis shoes. Actually, it's a very ugly combination, but for years it was a symbol for me of the most attractive clothes, my idea of an exotic wardrobe. Those two girls were symbols. Let's take a moment here to see. This is a slide that I'm not too familiar with, and that's her father. And this is probably Nora. Can you find Ayn Rand in that slide? Can you see her down there? We think that's Ayn Rand. Those two girls were symbols. Here she is on vacation in Switzerland or the Crimea or somewhere. That's why I show this. I admired them from afar as with a movie star infatuation. Those were the first value steps in my development. Now, you see why a lecturer such as myself has very little to do in talking about Ayn Rand's life and her development, because she does it for you. Those were the first value steps in my development. In tracing the growth of my values, I see a lot in the reasons for which I picked those two girls. It was independence, activity, and the unusual. If I were to name any one word that was my leitmotif, even then at age 6 or earlier, it would be the unusual. My whole development was based on the idea of looking for things that are interesting. Anything routine or conventional would immediately bore me. I was always looking for the unusual or purposeful. Those were the first two values that I could define. I went from that to the heroic concept of man. If somebody had asked me in what way is my sense of life different, I would have put it in these terms. I'm after the important, the significant, the heroic. Those days at the resort are very happy memories for me because that was my introduction to music. A military band played in the park all day long, and that's how I discovered all my early favorites from age 6 or earlier. My earliest favorite was Yip-A-Yay-Di-Yay, and there were several other numbers which I have since discovered were American or German tunes of the kind I call tiddlywink music. All the older people thought I had a very uncultured taste in music because I liked the tiddlywink music and the military marches. How did she react to disapproval about something as tenuous and hard to defend as artistic choices? How did she feel about being stigmatized as unsophisticated? It didn't disturb me. I felt they don't understand. I know, but they don't. As a matter of fact, by that time I felt quite defiant. This is just one more proof that this is mine and not theirs. I was very possessive about it. Ayn Rand discovered the world of romantic fiction by reading French children's magazines. Because her mother wanted her to become fluent in French, she subscribed for Ayn to these magazines. At first, at age 8, Ayn found only conventional, sentimental, naturalistic children's stories about little orphan girls and such. They bored her utterly. But then the magazine ran a story about a detective pursuing a jewel thief, and Ayn saw that fiction could be exciting and glamorous, not just a sentimentalized maudlin reflection of the boring conventional people around her. That was the first step towards the future writer. The second step came the next year at age 9. Quote, after reading the detective story, I began to like the idea of reading stories. I read everything in those magazines looking for something good. Mother saw my taste in stories and got me a subscription to a boys' magazine because it had adventure stories. She was always considerate in that way. And the next year, 1914, when I was 9, I started reading one story, The Mysterious Valley, and it was a love affair almost from the first installment. It was the story of some English officers in India. The spirit of the story was very much Rudyard Kipling. It was not championing the downtrodden or advocating the end of English rule over India, quite the opposite. It projected the villainy of those savages and the heroism of the British. The whole atmosphere was magnificent. That story gave me an abstraction of what I thought a civilized 20th century man would be. The idea of individualistic independence, of the self-reliant man, the free man. That story was the source of my early love of England and everything connected with it. England became my ideal. I saw it the same way I'd later viewed America, as a country of individuals, of very strong men, of freedom and important purposes. The British colonial empire was enormously romantic. Ayn Rand once told me that in contrast to the Marxist use of colonialism as a term meaning something evil, she was pro-colonialism. The hero of that story was named Cyrus, and he became Ayn Rand's first hero. And it had, as we'll see, an enormously important effect on the development of her sense of life. Cyrus had an audacious, defiant independence. I remember the first illustration. The reason why I have the first illustration here is that the mysterious valley has been found, is in the process of being translated, and will be published by Atlantean Press. Is Patricia Le Chevalier here? Would you stand up? This is the woman behind Atlantean Press, and she will be the one you should contact about eventually getting a copy of this. I certainly am. While all the other English captives are sitting down or cringing at the bottom of the cage, their spirit broken, Cyrus is standing, holding on to the bars of the cage, hurling insults at the Rajah who had captured them temporarily. He was saying, "You can do what you wish, but England will beat you. We'll get even." He was threatened with torture. He was going to be whipped to pieces, but he was completely defying about it, laughing at them. I think my concern with torture comes from that story. Recall that not only the torture of Galt, but the lashing of the hero of Anthem. Continuing. That story gave me a concrete view of what a man should be like. I don't know whether or not I had the term in my vocabulary then, but it was the concept of the heroic man, stressing intelligence, independence, and courage. My idea of the heroic took intelligence as an irreducible minimum. It had to be an unusually intelligent person to begin with. Then we go on from there. Intelligence directed to a practical purpose. That was the requirement of anything that I liked. That is, not pure theory, not the rationalistic type of intelligence, but intelligence devoted to a service in this world. She was very much mind-body integration from the start. Continuing, Cyrus was very much a cross between Reardon and Rourke, grim but not repressed, the man of action who was totally self-confident, enormously defiant. Nothing could stand in his way. No matter what the circumstances, he always knew what to do and always figured out how to get them out of their difficulties. From the moment he entered the story, he was the absolute leader of everything. At many points, the others lost courage, but Cyrus would never weaken. When the others were saying, "Now we're doomed," he just laughed. The illustration that particularly impressed me was a picture of Cyrus standing at a wall holding a sword. This is an actual page of the French text. Now let's zoom in on that illustration that particularly impressed her. Now she did not have this with her. She did not bring this from Russia. So this is entirely from memory in 1960. Here's her description of this illustration from 1914. He was a perfect drawing of my present kind of hero, tall, long-legged, wearing soldier's leggings, but no jacket, just an open-collared shirt, torn in front, open very low, sleeves rolled at the elbows, and hair falling down over one eye. I can just see her staring at this illustration for hours as a young girl. So there's no mystery, she says, as to where I formed the image of my type of man. I had seen many illustrations of men in that magazine and elsewhere, but they didn't appeal to me. This one did. It crystallized everything that I wanted. When I found this illustration, when I got it from Patricia Le Chevalier, I was rather surprised because I had known about her attachment to Cyrus and she had talked about this illustration. I had never seen it. What I think is amazing is how little there is there. It's not something that any objectivist would turn a page to and say, "Oh my God, it's John Galt." So she obviously brought to it an incredible amount of premises, artistic, visualized concerns, and she projected into this drawing what she was looking for. She says, incidentally, the name Kira is the feminine of Cyrus. Cyrus in Russian would be Kir, and that's one of the reasons why it became my favorite name. You see, I have no accidental values. Everything that I had half sensed from reading the detective story now became concrete. Here's a strong, independent man who is not afraid of anything, and he has a purpose. This is what's important in life. I was very aware that it wasn't literally this story or this hero, but that which it means. I was 9. Now thereafter, up to the age of 12, that was my exclusive love. I felt I'm totally outside of the concerns or the reality of anybody else. What they're interested in doesn't matter at all to me because I know something much higher. It was the feeling, this is what I want out of life, but they don't see it. The way she talks about this story and this hero suggests to me that this was the start of what I called Ayn Rand's metaphysical outlook, her living on a different plane. It was certainly a key step in forming her artistic premises, which for a romanticist means holding a metaphysical perspective. Now we come to what was, to use her metaphor, a major stop in the typing exercise, which is your life. You remember when Rourke and Winan are discussing, and he says, does your life roll on like a typing exercise even, or are there stops? This was one of the major stops. 1914 was a crucial turning point in my life. I made a crucial decision that summer abroad. Now, there's quite a bit of discussion about which one of these is Ayn Rand, which are the other two sisters. You want to, again, I don't know that this is 1914. I suspect it's actually a little bit later than that, more like 1915, 1916. After you get used to looking at all these pictures, there's no doubt that's the one. This one is too young. There are 3 sisters. Ayn is the eldest. And this is definitely Natasha because she has that long face and a different chin. The more you look at it, you get convinced this is she. I made a crucial decision that summer abroad. We were in London on the way back to Russia. They had been vacationing in Switzerland, and World War I broke out, and they had to immediately return home, but via London and Scandinavia. One day, walking on the street in London, I saw a poster advertising a musical revue. It showed the faces of 5 or 6 very attractive girls, most of them blonde, with page boy haircuts. I began to invent stories about those girls, projecting what kind of adventures I'd put them in. That evening, I was sitting alone in the hotel room while my parents were out, thinking of that poster and inventing stories, when suddenly it occurred to me, this is something people do professionally. People become writers and spend their life writing stories. And in just the time it took me to realize that, my next thought was, that is what I want to be. I'm going to be a writer. It was as simple as that. There was no long train of thought, just a sudden realization, like Newton's apple. My first feeling was, but of course. Then progressively I began to feel it was something very solemn, that now I had a purpose. Ayn Rand identified that purpose is the center of one's life. Here it is, already set at age 9. How does that purpose get enacted? Value is that which one acts to gain and or keep. What actions would be involved in bringing that purpose into reality? Quote, the next step came that winter when I was 10. I began to write novels at home and in school. In school, I would sit in the back row, put a book in front of me to hide what I was doing, and write the novels. I wrote 4 of them. I was consciously aware that this writing was just for me, that one doesn't publish until one is grown up, but it had all the emotional meaning for me of entering my profession. The influence of the mysterious valley pervaded everything I wrote, and I was aware that what I wrote was nowhere as good as that story. I didn't like my own stories as much, but I was also aware that this is the standard towards which I have to grow. I was very objective about that. Notice the incredible maturity of this 10-year-old girl trying to do something as hard as to write stories. She looks at them and she says, these are not very good. And it doesn't bother her because she thinks, well, but then I'm only 10 and I have to develop my ability. She never had the view that there was some inborn talent that one mystically had or didn't have. It was a job to learn. Let me give you a brief sample of the kind of stories she was inventing. The heroines of my stories were always my own age. That year, they were all 10 years old. The next year, they were 11. But the stories weren't autobiographical at all. They were the projection of the most fantastic things. The girls always looked somewhat like Dagny. They were slender, long-legged, with bobbed hair and light eyes. They were more or less the type of that tennis-playing girl, Daisy. One story was about a little girl who saved England single-handed. This was 1915, and World War I was on. The heroine was a girl 10 years old in England, since England was my ideal country at that time. England is threatened with a German invasion. That was the big topic during the war. This girl marches into a recruiting office and declares that she wants to enlist in the British fleet. She's 10 now. She's told that she is too young and they don't take girls. She replies, "So you want to prevent me from fighting for my country?" Which puts the recruiting officer in a corner. He couldn't answer that argument. So they allow her to enlist in the fleet. I think that's very typical of her, too. I remember being slightly stuck in regard to the middle of the story, but I already had the climax in mind very clearly. So the middle was something fairly vague about how well she did as a sailor in the fleet. Then one day she's on leave, and she's walking alone down a deserted stretch of beach, when suddenly she sees the whole German fleet approaching. On this deserted sand beach, there's a single dried-up bush, and in it, conveniently, she finds a machine gun. I think I explained it by saying this was a sentinel post. She hides in the bush, and as the first shipload of Germans begins to descend, she mows them down with the machine gun. And then the next one comes, and she mows them down. They very conveniently waited in line, apparently. And she routs them. The story ended with her receiving a war medal and being hailed as having saved England. And then she says this next, laughing. Now, I think that was romantic, but not realism. You know, she called her style romantic realism. Now, my theme in these lectures is, in part, how entirely unique Ayn Rand was, and a question that I had always wondered about personally was, how did she see herself as a child? Did she know she was unique? Did she take herself for granted? And tomorrow in the lecture, I'll pick up with that as my first topic. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For the question period, let me establish 2 ground rules. The first is that I will not answer any questions regarding Ayn Rand's romantic life. As you know, there were some unusual aspects to her romantic life, which I'm not going to talk about because A, I think that's private, and B, I don't have anything in the way of inside knowledge or personal knowledge. I don't have her to speak on that topic, so I couldn't give anything objective. And secondly, I will not answer any questions premised on attacks raised by her enemies in their biographies of her. Incidentally, even while she was alive, there began to be biographies appearing that covered her, briefly. For instance, there was a biography of Bennett Cerf. And in the biography of Bennett Cerf, there's a story related as to when Atlas Shrugged was being published. Bennett Cerf wanted to cut, this is not true, but the story that is related in his posthumous autobiography is that he wanted to cut Galt's speech. The story was. And Miss Rand was against it, as you can imagine she would be if this had taken place, which it didn't. And the story, as some of you probably recall, that she said, to defend not cutting it, she said, "Would you cut the Bible?" And Bennett Cerf just found her, completely undealable with, and so he acceded to her wishes. Now that I asked Ayn Rand about that story, because this came out in about 81. And I asked her, "Is that story true?" And she said, "No." She said, "I never said that. Would you cut the Bible?" She said, "The Bible needs cutting." And I said at that time, I said, there's some other people publishing, I think Gary Cooper, his autobiography came out and she had a role in that. And there's several of them where she was beginning to be mentioned in people's biographies. And I said, well, maybe I should publish a note in the Objectivist Forum that a number of biographies are coming out, and Miss Rand wants people to be aware that they should not trust what they see in these biographies, that many of them she knows about already contradict her own firsthand knowledge of what happened. And she said, yes, that would be a good idea. Unfortunately, I forgot to do that. So the nice general disclaimer that could have been issued before some of the most scurrilous biographies came out was not printed. I will say a few words about Barbara Brandon's biography because I've read that. I didn't read any of the others because I considered them too far from reality, and I was too repulsed by having read Barbara Brandon's biography, which I was able to do without contributing to her viciousness, by at least financially, by getting a free copy that was circulating. It is completely false. There is a saying that a half-truth is worse than a lie. And what that book is filled with half-truths, the whole purpose of which is to make money by praising Ayn Rand while stabbing her in the back. The whole projection of Ayn Rand that comes out of that novel is completely false. It is rife with factual errors. Okay, so that, having made that brief excursion into non-reality, I will like to entertain questions. Dr. Locke.
Do you plan to publish any of this material at some time?
I'm glad you asked that, because originally I did. I was going to edit all of these transcripts for publication as an autobiography. I've spent a year trying to do that, and it's just too much for me. It sounded like a wonderful project. Of course, I loved Ayn Rand, and the idea of freeing her own words from the misuse that's been made of them by other authors who had access to these interviews was very motivating to me in the abstract. But when I sat down to edit megabytes of prose, having to do it very exactly to not change the meaning and the emotional sense of what was in the transcript, it just was month after month after month of going over and over and editing tiny, word changes here and there, and should this sentence come before that sentence? And I decided that that is not what I want to do with my life. So I actually created 3 chapters which go up to her entering college. It stops just short of her entering college. and someone else will do the project, and I hope that maybe the part I've done will be able to be used. I don't know. But I think that will be done. Dr. Peikoff is looking for someone, a professional writer, professional editor-writer, to take these transcripts and make a book out of them. So in not too long, there will be, but not by me, what you're looking for. So this material will not be lost. It will be available as a published book. It's just a practical difficulty.
When I hear you speak of the materials in the warehouse, my mind goes to the fire of the Library of Alexandria. So, has any thought been given to putting the materials in the hands of professional archivists, or giving them photocopies, or other kinds of reproductions? And a related question is, do you think it makes sense to make these materials available to all scholars?
Yes, thought has been given. They're in a fireproof warehouse. They're not in somebody's garage. A great deal of effort has been made to preserve these. Things of irreplaceable value have been photocopied where possible. I don't claim that what has been done is complete, but repeated efforts have been made to go through this material. You would be amazed. I said she saved everything. You'd be amazed what's there. There is her passport to leave Russia, to come here. There's every contract she ever signed. There are movie scripts. There are photographs. There's every note that she wrote to Frank O'Connor or he wrote to her saying, "Darling, wake me at 10:30. I have to go meet with NAL." And there must be 200 or 300 notes that just say, "Wake me at X," which he wrote to her. She adored him so much that she saved every little scrap of paper that he wrote on. There's, I think, 47, Dr. Berliner, are you here? Something like 47 boxes, isn't it? Or more? 65 boxes. Now, archiving it or having something done professionally is a good idea, but it involves spending a lot of money and making sure that you have the right person to do it. So you really have to talk to the estate of Ayn Rand about this. We would like to have something set up, or if I can speak for what Dr. Peikoff has said to me privately, he would like to have some kind of permanent use made of this, making it available to scholars. But translating that into reality is not an obvious thing at this stage. And the only scholars that would want to go over it at present are probably in this room. So don't think that the staff of Harvard University is eager to get at these papers.
Is there any chance that that particular photo that's up on the screen might be reprinted with the sisters, of course, cropped out? But I'm particularly taken with that photo, and I don't know if anybody else would be or not, but it's very striking.
When I sell this tape, if it's sold, I will try and reproduce, if I can get permission to, the slides as a handout with the tapes. But this is all the property of the estate of Ayn Rand, so you have to ask Dr. Peikoff about that. I have some other terrific slides coming up in the next lecture, but not as many. Most of the slides are from the period when they were not under communism. So most of the slides are in these early years, and I have very few slides from her early teens. I'd like to take an opportunity to do something for you. I've talked about the tiddlywink music, and you've heard about it repeatedly if you've been in objectivism for a while, but maybe you never have heard some tiddlywink music. So I would like to play some from a tape made of Ayn Rand's records. If you'll excuse me for 1 second. I selected my two favorites arbitrarily. I don't know that they were Ayn Rand's favorites, except that all of these were records she treasured. I don't know that these were what she called her top favorites. But I like them, so arbitrarily I'm going to play you a slow piece and a fast piece. The slow piece is called Destiny Waltz. It's mentioned in We the Living. I hope this comes across. Going to interrupt that one, which you've heard the essence of because we are limited in time, and go back to one that's a fast one that I like even better. This would be a slight pause here while I rewind the tape because they were not contiguous. This next one she didn't discover until 1950, but it's obviously from a very early period. And it's called Canadian Capers. Can you hear these all right, by the way? The first one? Thank you. You can just imagine what that meant to a girl growing up in Russia. She didn't hear that particular one, but that style of music meant to a girl like Ayn Rand, trapped in the sordid, ugly, repressive regime like Russia in her teenage years. We'll continue tomorrow. Thank you.